I am Holly Lynn Walrath. I am the managing editor of Interstellar Flight Press, and we're very, very excited to have our first virtual book launch today. And I'm just so stoked to introduce Brandon to y'all. I've known Brandon for a couple years now in the speculative poetry community, and I always admired your work, and I was so excited to see that you had submitted to our poetry book call. It's just so lovely, like when you see someone in the submissions pile that you know, and you're like, oh yes, that's the best feeling. And so I'm really glad to have to have your book, Can You Sign My Tentacle? And this was one that a lot of our slush readers just really loved and were very excited to have. And throughout like the process of putting this book out, all of our volunteers have been really stoked for it, so that's always special. But I want to introduce Brandon. Brandon's going to read a little bit from the book, and then we'll have some Q&A afterwards. Brandon O'Brien is a writer and performance poet and artist and game designer, which I want to ask you about later, from Trinidad and Tobago. And your work has appeared in Uncanny, Strange Horizons, Reckoning, basically all of the major speculative poetry places. And you are also the editor of Faya, a magazine of Black speculative fiction, which is a super exciting magazine. And again, we'll, I'm sure, talk about that in the Q&A because I love your work there. And Brandon's book, Can You Sign My Tentacle, is out today from Interstellar Flight Press. We're a small press. We publish small books, so chapbooks, poetry collections, novellas of those type. We are definitely an indie press and definitely still working on our roster of books, but you can support us via Patreon. If you want to see more books like Brandon's come out, it's super helpful because there are not a huge amount of markets like us right now. So I'm very excited about the works that we have coming out. I'm very excited to talk to you today, Brandon. So Brandon, do you want to take over and read some of your poetry to us?
I would like that very much,
Um,
actually. Thank you so very much for that. And I should also add that I am like ultimately very flattered that I got an opportunity to uh share my work with you and Interstellar during that poetry collections call. In part because we knew each other and valued each other's work for a long time, but also just because I'm glad that I got someone whose work I admire and whose voice I admire to look at my work, because it made me feel like there was a level of depth and understanding that I knew I could get from having your eye on that work. So I'm really glad that this finally exists. I'm really excited to be able to share it with people. I'm still very nervous about the fact that it exists. Like the fact that my name is on a thing is actually still very overwhelming. Um, but yeah, I'm very excited to talk more about this book. So I'm going to read a few things. I'm not sure exactly how much time we potentially have just to read. So I'm just gonna like put a couple of things together. It's just kind of jump around the collection a bit. For those who don't know like much about the like thematic attachment of the collection, it is essentially driven by this like one weird gimmicky idea that I had one time, which is what if we just took all of the creatures from H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, and instead of having them do all of the strange and unfathomable and frightening things that you're accustomed to seeing them do, they just instead are in awe of black entertainers and ask them for their autographs for no real reason. Um, Well, I mean, there is a reason in my brain, but what if it just happened and we never had to think about it? And I still like really, I just wrote a few poems based on that idea randomly one time, and people liked them, and I thought that it would be cool to just put that thing together, and had no expectation that people were going to think that it was worthy of being bound in paper, and now here we are, where Holly has decided to prove me wrong. And I'm very excited to share some of those silly poems with you all this afternoon. So I'm going to start with the very first poem of that cycle that I have written, which I had written like months before I even knew this was going to be a collection, just as a joke, which is called Hastur Asks for Donald Glover's Autograph. A. In his house at Stone Mountain, real hip-hop Gambino stays woke. In floaters, he can see space-time on opposite ends of a line of scrimmage, watch them collide into nebulae to the point where he can't even find himself out of that mess. He doesn't really know sleep. There's too much to know. Before the entourage parks outside the 2013 version of Sway in the Morning, he's already seen how it all middles. His gaze collides with the higher homes so hard, he sits in the studio sleepy-eyed and static. He has no problem telling folks they will all die someday. He gives away Nostradamus in 32 bars. He donates his barstool philosophy in place of a chorus. B. The other realm is lit like neon purple-green on sparklers, while the eldritch elders sup sauce and complain about their complicated family lives, when Donald Glover, in a maroon cape, floats by on grace. The Peacock King himself flags him down before he can disappear and goes, "Aren't you in the wrong place?" Bino says, "Nah." Hastur goes, "I don't think you wear that." Bino says, "I wear whatever, man." When Hastur asks for an autograph for his shapeless niece, the pen bursts vertices of truth all over the girl's wings, but she plays it off like it's nothing. They gawk at the dude like he's so huge, his own orbit's unbeatable even by apathy. He'll forget their faces shortly. The idea of it will probably vex them all so much. He'll take the nihilism with him, though. C. If America is in the title, it's documentary. First off, the man in that footage has no name, or is called hopelessness, or is called legacy, or just answers to hawk cry. That ain't Troy. No matter. Both of them lucky to be alive, but one got on a boat, allegedly transcended all of this. The other dreamt tendrils of things it shares a name with until anxiety turns solid inside. The other tried to film what he saw, but the lens kept finding things to laugh at no matter the angle, even the bodies. The camera turned and opened its jaw on him, shattered onto him like a light bulb, and the truth, frayed, started screaming curses. No, that ain't Troy. But he's in the frame somewhere. D. Twin Peaks The Return, Part 8. Got a light? Something bursts in the desert and gives birth to darkness that waits to be consumed fresh. Crawls into ears like lullaby, crawls between lips like offering, takes advantage of those who sleep, goes looking for fragile light to try to eat. Atlanta, Robin Season, Episode 6, Teddy Perkins. Darius just wanted to pick up a sweet piano. Turns out that goodness is often light sensitive. Turns out that darkness leaves all of its windows open and makes lullaby out of everything. Turns out there's a duality in everything, and there's blood everywhere. Light takes its own life, before it can be food. Both episodes kill fearsome dread with humility. Both tell you to run from what lingers in wooden rooms. Both are bright and odd, end in flat light burst. And plus, Rotten Tomatoes loves them both. E. You ask him about chaos in front of the late night studio audience. His autograph changes shape before your eyes. You ask him why he's so nonchalant about death. He reminds you nothing is more freeing than knowing the cosmos isn't attached to you. It feels like floating, he says. I wish I could still have that, he says. Uneasy, the late night host tries not to look one tall audience member in the eye. Mustard coat, wriggling sinew, all grins and hollers. The host asks, why can't you have it? The cosmos just won't leave me alone. So that's one poem.
Beautiful.
Thank you so very much. I have put a lot of the poems in this collection also speak to another weird kind of duality that randomly showed up as I started thinking more about Lovecraft's work and what it potentially means and says, not just about the speculative genre, but about the world that we live in and the way that we interact with each other. And I discovered something very intriguing that I thought was also very funny, that I liked poking fun of in the collection, which is, for someone whose body of work has regularly not been as empathetic towards the experiences of people of color, a lot of Lovecraft's themes are accidentally real hip hop. And that gave birth to a sub-series in the collection called the Lovecraft Theses, which are comparisons between those thematic outcroppings and the lyrics of popular rap songs. So the next poem that I'm going to read is Lovecraft Thesis number 2. Splendor and Misery, Face B, Track 2. Violence makes good background noise for anything, even for knowledge. People suffer for knowing all the time in your stories. You know, the ones where something shrouded in shadow stalks the corridors between neon and dancing, with its eyes on everything gentle and its tendrils on everything glimmering. How dare you tell me this is somehow unfathomable? What is the block, child? What is it, if not the night turning liminal, sliding into the dark upper sea where we hold back knowing? It batters the bones of things that want to see beyond their horizon. It is the storm that walls off the new edge of the world, the barricade that blurs treasure or threat outside your reach. And yet you will still wish to know, to venture beyond Fair's camp, to lose your mind in its gyre. The corner will cry in its usual way, cry copper at betrayal, cry having faith in what you know. But you will cross the threshold anyway. So the next poem that I'm going to read is dedicated to several of my friends in turn, who are all referred to as one singular person, because we've been through a lot. We were all collectively through a lot, even while this collection was being put together. And at some point, I just wanted to speak a little bit to some of the frustrations that folks were having dealing with the world as it was and how it could be. So this poem is titled That Business They Call Utopia, Part 2. I've witnessed that business they call building a utopia for so long. Higher up the Atlantic, where yearning to breathe free meets committal at the gate. I've been so frightened, friend. They say over here that we catch the other nations' colds across the water in the storms. So often I wonder how to ward them off. What warmth but a hearth of good mornings? What vitamins but the scent of fruit from neighbors? I've witnessed this utopia building business bake bricks from screaming, friend. And I've seen the masonry trade grow on it, shake down big spenders for iron, for foil tents, for rations, for tears with which one churns cement. We keep saying that this is like a fantasy novel, the ones where there are great houses or great cities or great casts, the ones that cast us cast away, the ones where the aching children free the phoenix from their rib cage and torch it all. We keep saying it's a poorly written one, because look at the dialogue, look at the mise en scène, and look, there are so many children, but where are all the flames? And friend, I've seen the utopia business pick up outside your house. I've worried about the shape it takes. Worried about whether the scenes resemble the shouting on Market Street or the shouting on Tragarit Road. Whether kingdoms copper foot lifted from the waters of war and crawled to the shore with all its crows. What else can my soft hands give but worry? And is saying so even my right? But if the stories taught me anything about how to prepare for this moment, it's this. Everyone has a little fire to spare, a neighbor for whom to share it, someone for whom hope is the phoenix still waiting, pecking at our skin while we call it fair. And you can have my fire, but first, have this other thing. I love you, friend. And I love you more with each flambeau word your tongue waves for your street, with each phoenix word as you throw the weighted consonants against the glass walls of this. Take both. The stories say when we can spare just those, one beside one, two beside two, there's no wickedness our clasped hands can't split, even when beside is an island in the other direction where you cannot hear my heartbird crying out to yours, be safe, but burn those bastards' pillars down. And it sings. It sings the song the poems say it would sing. For you, friend. You. And I think that's where I'm going to end the reading portion of this get together. For now, I might share more at some point later if you all want, but I feel like that's a fitting place to end.
That was so good. It's one thing like when you're editing a collection, like you're very narrowly focused, right? Like you're like, I'm gonna make sure everything is perfect. But it's another thing when you get to hear you read it. It's just so special. Thank you for that. I'm gonna open up our kind of question section with a couple questions.
Mhm.
Um, which I guess the first one is just to dive more into like how you came up with this idea and working with Lovecraft, which is sort of this like double-edged influence, I guess.
Indeed, yes.
Maybe you can talk more about that.
So, like, I wasn't joking when I said that this was all very, very random. Um, by which I mean that first poem, Haster asks for Donald Glover's autograph, was literally something I wrote on a lark. The literal story is um, this may have been exactly 2 years ago, around this exact same time, in fact. um, Uncanny Magazine was putting together a little poetry reading event for all of its commissioned poets for what would have been at that point year 6, if I'm not mistaken. Um, and I was commissioned to write for Uncanny and hadn't written a poem at all yet, hadn't even thought about what the poem I would write for that future issue would be, because I had a whole year to think about it. And I was like, so I should read something, but I don't want to read something that I've already written there because they've already seen it and don't need to hear me reading it. Let's just write a poem. And Haster asked for Donald Glover's autograph, just kind of spilled out as a joke. Just me going, wouldn't it be funny if instead of this like mythic representation of not trusting or valuing the experiences of Black people came to Donald Glover and went, I love your work. Can you sign this for my niece Cathilla? And that just turned into that poem. And I read it and people liked it. And I was like, that's cool. I'm never going to think about it again. And while that was happening, like things were just kind of falling together in the corners of it. I would just like put that down somewhere and go, that's also nice, but this is not a collection yet. And then when you opened your call for submissions, I looked at that pile of poems and went, this is not a collection, but let's see if I'm wrong. And again, you proved me wrong. And I still don't know, I'm very grateful, but I still don't know how or why. So yes, that's essentially how that materialized. All of the like deeper thoughts that I've had about the collection since then are things that happened during the editing process and not the writing process. So I do think about it a great deal more deeply and more considerably now as a result of spending time with those works. But when I wrote it, I had no intention. Like if you asked me when I wrote that first poem, would you ever put together a collection that in some way speaks to Lovecraft? And it's like, Lovecraft don't want to hear from me and I don't want to talk to Lovecraft. And then it's turned into me actually discovering all of the more radical things that can come from the process of having those kinds of discussions that have nothing to do with attempting to be cruel or dismissive to Lovecraft's body of work, and much more to do with fathoming Blackness in the speculative in a way that is affirming to Black readers and potentially educational, hopefully educational and hopeful to other readers, without making it about me potentially standing on a soapbox and shouting down at Lovecraft. Although I do think he deserves it, but still.
I mean, I don't know about you, but like when I never read Lovecraft before I got kind of involved in this science fiction fantasy community. Like I just hadn't read Lovecraft. It wasn't like something that spoke to me.
Mm-hmm.
So
well, the curious thing is I at some point was in the same boat, like except for like the very obvious things that everybody knows because it's the way that you got into the Cthulhu mythos, like Call of Cthulhu or Shadow over Innsmouth, the things that you will read, the things that at least at one point you came across in a piece of media because it was Lovecraftian media, like you played it in a board game or you played it in a video game. I just had to think about the fact that this is part of that collective mythos while already experiencing it. And like, as I said, a lot of the thoughts that I had about that body of work didn't come up until after having to sit with the collection for a good period of time and ask myself, well, what ultimately do I think is true about these things? And one of the most interesting things that I think came out of that process, which I have to be like careful about saying because I don't want it to seem like I'm I'm pitying a man that I did not know. But a lot of the Lovecraft mythos comes from a very peculiar place of fear. By which I mean horror obviously speaks to fear and the things that frighten us very deeply, but as a genre is regularly committed to the question of how do we face those fears? What do we learn in the face of those fears? And yet a lot of Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos is dedicated to, what if learning is bad? What if you shouldn't know things? What if when you know more, it unravels you and makes you a worse or less whole person? Maybe you'd be better off not knowing and faring anyways. Like,
Wow.
there is
Yeah.
something kind of dangerously pitiable there. And again,
Oh
I'm not trying
yeah.
to be like cold or bitter to this person that I did
Yeah.
not know, but like, there is something worth interrogating in valuing that kind of perspective, that the things that are potentially unknowable or unfathomable are worthy of fear because knowing them will make us worse.
Hmm.
And even more so, like, the thing that everybody consistently refers to as part of the, as an element of Lovecraftian horror, is the idea that you discover that there is this thing that is greater and more powerful than you, and in the face of your own weakness, you go insane, which is ableist on its face already, but even more so begs this very interesting question of why things are bigger than us all the time, and it's never affected us before. And as I mentioned in the author's note to the collection, um, the industrial rap group Clipping, led by Daveed Diggs, came out with an album called Splendor and Misery that had a very interesting and poignant answer to that question, which is, marginalized people have the experience of discovering that things are purposely greater and have more power and agency in the world than they do all the time. And there is a level of freedom in knowing that the thing that we're referring to in particular doesn't care about me and doesn't mean me any harm. And that the things that use their power to do harm are the things that I should spend my actual energy being worried about or afraid of or acting against. And that I don't have time to worry about whether there is an eldritch being in space who is more powerful, because he didn't notice me, so I shouldn't care. And I think that
Right.
there is I think that there is something radical in facing that head on, and in being able to say that things are bigger than us all the time. And what matters is what those bigger things do and not whether they're bigger, because I am not here for my own ego. I am here to survive.
That's awesome. I could
I
listen to
mean,
you talk about that
it
all day.
is it is very awesome. And I'm glad to talk
Yeah.
about it every day because like I'm like, there is already a breadth of work challenging Lovecraft's ideology
Yeah. Yeah.
that has existed before I even started writing speculative poetry, before I started writing published fiction at all. And I think that a lot of those things are really dope. I think that
Yeah.
Cassandra Kaw's work is really dope. I think that Victor Laval's work is very dope. Um, Everybody's already seen Lovecraft Country and can speak to how
Yeah.
significant and radical Lovecraft Country is in terms of reframing that mythos in a way that doesn't shy away from how dramatically hostile those um the experiences in those stories are, but recontextualizes it in the wake of the fact that people have the marginalized people have hostile experiences all the time and don't have time to decide whether one is more frightening than the other.
Right.
And I think that all of those things are really radical. And I think that in some way or form, being able to experience all of those things as somebody who previously just never wanted to engage with the mythos at all, had given me a kind of greater acknowledgement and value of the ways in which you can take a potentially harmful story on its face and unlock truly radical stories from within it without altering the story itself, but viewing it from the perspective of the people who would have to live in that space in their own radical ways. So yeah, I owe this book owes its existence to other more talented, smarter, and more erudite people than me. So yes.
Yeah, I love Lovecraft Country as an example because I think that's the one like people know about, but
Mhm.
um and I love your take on it because it is true, like just I think there's often this feeling like of not that marginalized people face, maybe of like not wanting to engage with something that has been harmful, and but when it does happen, it's so valuable, and so I thank you for that. One question from the audience is, how has your work in game design impacted your speculative fiction writing?
Ooh. I think I will say, like, on the one hand, I think a lot about the mechanics of language very often. Like, one of the things that stands out when you're doing tabletop game design in particular is how you phrase the options that a player has available to them influences how aware they are that they have options or how those options work. Um, Game design is very much a kind of technical writing. Um, and it requires a kind of awareness of how to communicate the things that you can do in game that not only let people know that it is possible, but encourage them to explore its possibility whenever they want to do a thing. Like, it's very easy for someone to know that a rule exists in the game and exactly how that rule works, and yet spend an entire session or an entire campaign never doing it because they didn't know how it would affect the thing that they wanted to do. And there is a great level of care that you have to dedicate to framing those instructions in ways that invite them to use the options that are available to them, even in the service of catastrophe. Like, there is a kind of poetry in writing a game rule that invites someone to do something because it is foolish and reckless, because that's going to make gameplay fun. Like, I got into game design because of I got into game design because a friend introduced me to a game design fellowship being run by Avery Alder, who's like wonderfully talented and compassionate indie game designer, who uh, designed a game called Dream Askew, the system of which like invites people to make decisions that are not always personally favorable, in favor of exploring the possibility of what is unlocked when players engage with each other recklessly in this space. Because in the real world, you will have opportunities to get mad at somebody or have a falling out or express your feelings in a way that other people will not understand or will clash with. And while it is narratively rewarding to see that go well, instead, the game tells you, well, you will get a game resource, you'll get a mechanical resource in order to do so, knowing that now you have to respond to the fallout of the decision that you made narratively. Because now responding to that in that way with the resources that you have is fun in and of itself. And that asks people to continue going, hey, how can we make this scene worse? How can we all be bad to each other in this moment, in the business of really digging into what our characters want? And the thing that I'm still trying to channel in my writing as a result is, how do stories as a result ask readers to not expect people to behave in certain ways, or to encourage the story to ask someone to do something bad or unhealthy in a way that will be dramatically engaging. And especially in poetry as well, how the writing of that work can encourage the reader to want certain unexpected things from the act of reading it. How can the act of reading this poem be an attempt to commit you to perform an action in the real world, or commit to unseeing a certain kind of thing that you regularly see as a result of the way that you engage with the language. And I will say that I don't think I'm there yet, but the fact that I can ask that question regularly is consistently inspiring. And one of these days, I hope that, like, similarly on a lock, I could write like a chapbook of poems where each poem is its own game, and you get to play it in the real world with people who do not know that you're playing an RPG because they think you're just reading a poem, but we're not there yet. So
I love
yes.
it. You've written like some writing games, right? They're like
Yes.
games. I don't know
I've
how to
written
describe them.
I've written there is a kind of language that presently kind of exists to describe those games. Like there's a version of those that kind of RPG called a keepsake game, where the way that you play, either one player or in small groups, um, is by writing journal entries or writing other epistolary entries of your experience as this character in this space. And at the end of the game, you have that finished document of all of those experiences. Um, and I've written something similar to that. There's a game on my itch.io page, therisingtides.itch.io. The game is called The Refraction. It's about a community of people attempting to write their own experiences surviving a harrowing experience in their community. And the way that it's played is everyone writes a poem about their collective experience with a particular tragedy that's taken place in their space to their character, and read those poems to everyone else. And you don't move from one stage of play to the next until at least one other person has heard you read the poem that you've written aloud. And it's designed in that way because it makes it accessible for people to play without sharing distance, um, without sharing space, or without having to commit to a set block of time to play, because everybody can consistently engage and know that once they've sent a voice note to their friend or gotten a Zoom call, everybody has moved from one stage to the next, and that at the end of that session of play, there is now a series of things that people have written about people who are not themselves attempting to channel an experience, and they get to ask themselves at the end of that experience, how much of this is still valuable to the people that we are right now, given the experiences that we actually have in the real world, because we wrote them while still fathoming ourselves in the real world, especially if you're not writing them all at once, especially if you're not playing like in one night, how those poems might potentially bleed into things that you were engaging in your real life. I am very kind of proud of that kind of experience, and I want to play with more things like that, where the end product is a series of poems and everybody gets to ask themselves, do we think that this is cool? Do we think that this is worth sharing? Because it's also an opportunity for people who have never written before to just write as a source of play and not have to think about, oh, I'm not trying to impress somebody right now, I'm just playing the game, and then come out of that experience going, that was actually rather impressive and I'm proud of myself and I want to do this more.
That's deeply sweet and comforting. Like there's something about that that is just like I've done like at conventions where we do like, you know, the poetry spine where everyone kind of contributes something and it ends up in this like larger poem, but that's so sweet. I don't know, I just find that like comforting in some way.
Yeah.
Someone in the comments asked, and y'all feel free to drop any other questions in the chat or raise your hand if you want to ask something. Someone asked, what poems or poets excite you?
This is a long list. This is
It's
a very
so
long
many, like,
list.
right? It's hard.
Um I will open with speculative answers because because it slowly leads into me making what I think is like a very um radically heartwarming revelation about this moment right now. So first of all, I'd be remiss if I said that I don't definitely adore your poetry, Holly.
Oh,
Um, I
thanks.
think that your work is very, very dope. this is me throwing out to the audience that Holly also has a book coming out very soon. It's called The Smallest of Bones. It's
I
being
know.
published by
Thank
Clash
you.
Books. And you should definitely get it because it's rad. But I adore like most of the speculative poetry that I engage in the space that we're presently in right now is genuinely beautiful. As I've said, I adore your poetry. I adore Amal El Motar's poetry. I adore Fran Wilde's poetry, who also has a book coming out. And I think that that's also rad. Um, I uh, I've been really curious to see more work by B. Sharice Moore, who is presently the current poetry editor of Fire, who took over when I left. Um, and I mean, obviously, a lot of the other Black poets who are published in Fire are very impressive to me. I consistently go out of my way to look for new work by Uche Ogbuji, who writes very astounding, very like beautiful poetry that is similarly incredibly speculative and incredibly bound to African national culture in a way that I think is so beautiful and like engaging, even in such a way that when you don't immediately know uh, what the language is or what is being immediately referred to in that moment, you can still draw exactly for the thing that is taking place in that poem, um, and not and feel like you're sharing this space with the persona of the work is really radical and beautiful way that I love a lot when it happens. I also definitely want to shout out Shivani Ramlochan, whose poetry I have always like stopped what I've whenever I read a new poem by Shivani Ramlochan, I stop what I'm doing and let people know that it's amazing. Um, uh, she has a poem that is available in a collection that was published during the Bocas Lit Fest. The name of which totally escapes me now because I'm very bad at these things. But I love it a lot. Um, because it's like this beautiful and angry and raw and incredibly striking work that you can literally download for free right now from the Bocas published collection, Reclaim, Restore, Return, Futurist Tales from the Caribbean, edited by Karen Lord and Tobias Bakel. So you can like literally just hold that work in your ebook reader of choice right now and know exactly how rad it is and know exactly why I my poetry wants to be Shivani Ramlochan's poetry when it grows up. Um, so yeah, but outside of the speculative space, outside of what I regularly engage with as the speculative space, I also think a lot about the poetry of Danez Smith, who's always like very poignant and very engaging. Um, I've been rereading poetry by Nate Marshall because I recently got his latest collection, Finna, and I think that it's really dope. And I think that the way that it engages with the inherent poetry of your name is really beautiful and really like informative and asks you to stop and think about your own name and the ways in which people address you in these really interesting ways. Um, and yeah, I'm sure if I was like, if I were to like take the green screen behind me down and just look at my shelf and just like be listing off more poets for the rest of the evening, because I'm trying.
Right.
I also keep trying as much as possible to read people that I don't already know and try to engage with work that I'm not already familiar with, because poetry is just rad and I like being able to hold a poetry book in my hand and go, I can just read this in a night and like have a full experience. Um, so yeah, um, poetry is rad. You should read more. everyone should everyone should be reading more poetry right now. This month is typically a month in which people do the Sealy challenge, but I haven't bought new poetry in so long that I haven't been. I didn't do it this year. The challenge is to read a new book of poetry every day for the month of August. Um, and like I keep wanting to like stop what I'm doing and just like reserve 30 books coming up soon. And just like pick up one every day in August, but I haven't done that yet, so soon.
I love that. I hadn't heard about that, but someone mentioned it on Twitter the other day, and I was like, oh, I like that.
Yeah.
Someone asked on Facebook, with so much reference to hip hop and the music industry and performance in your poetry, what are some of the ways that albums and poetry collections are similar or different? So that's one part of the question, which I love that. That's a great
Hmm.
question. And then if one poem from your book would be released as a single, which one would it be?
Um. Ooh, I'm gonna definitely have to think about that part too for a bit. Um. But that first part is a very interesting question because, like, um, in hip hop culture, the word rap is regularly referred to as a backronym for rhythm and poetry. That it is the act of being poetic simply on a beat. Um, and I think that that by itself is a very engaging metaphor. It's technically true about all music, to be perfect, all non-instrumental music, non solely instrumental music, to be fair. But still, it's very true about hip hop in particular. Um, and I think that like that ultimate question of how a poetry collection and an album are similar or dissimilar is that when a work is made up of individual parts, the ultimate question that people ask about the work is what is true about the work as a whole, even when those things may not be entirely true or non like not very simply true about every individual piece of that collection. Um, and I think that as a result, the finished product of a poetry collection or an album is meant to ask a thing or say a thing, even if all of the things that it says about that thing are not all the same. Like individual songs or poems can be in conflict with each other or take place at different points in the overall narrative that is taking place, or can be about different people or be about somebody whose mind has changed, but they're still referring to a thing, a moment, an object, a relationship, in a way that is supposed to be fully engaging and obvious, even when those individual moments are not very obvious. Like one of the immediate examples that come to mind is there is a hip hop album called The Impossible Kid by a New York rapper named Aesop Rock, who I love a lot. It's like so clever and so talented, both as a rapper and as a producer. And The Impossible Kid is, in a lot of ways, about struggling with mental illness and the decisions that we make in order to deal with our own mental health in the wake of um, vastly different kinds of experiences that make that mental health struggle so much more difficult. And what's interesting about the album is that it's obviously always about those things. And the ways that it engages with those things are so radically different that one song is about making the decision to go to therapy in the wake of one of your friends passing away. The song immediately after that is about going to therapy and deciding that you don't actually enjoy therapy. And then the song after that is about adopting a cat. because adopting a cat gives you joy and you need a moment of joy right now and your therapist told you so. And then the song after that is about moving out of your hometown because you want to be left alone for a bit and deal with yourself by yourself. And all of those things are still about that same theme. But every individual song, if you listen to it by itself, you'll go, oh, that's dope in itself. That's a radical experience on its own. Um, and sometimes those connections are tighter, sometimes they're looser, sometimes they're all a running train of thought, and sometimes they're not. But ultimately, even when it's not immediately obvious that they're all speaking to a thing, they're often all speaking to a thing. And sometimes, to be perfectly honest, sometimes the thing that they're speaking to is, I have money and people respect me, and that's also fine. Because another very beautiful thing about hip hop as a genre that I have conflicting feelings about, but ultimately love, is that hip hop is a place where Black people get to say that they're worthy of love, even if we do not like the ways in which they think they're worthy of love. Because other people get to be worthy of love for obviously terrible things all the time, and society never judges them for it. So yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I like how you kind of brought out this point of like an album has movement, a poetry collection can also have movement. You know, like you're not always, you kind of end up in a different place at the end than you were in the beginning sometimes. These are really great questions, everyone. I really appreciate it. Another question.
There was a second version to that question.
The second part of the question.
And I think, I feel very strongly about the idea that, like, if I were to write hip hop versions of any like train of thought in this collection, they would be the Utopia Cycle would get their own thing. But as an individual poem, I would love very much to turn one of the postcard poems in this collection. There are two poems in the collection that begin with the title Postcard 20XX, about an imagined Caribbean future and how people survive in it. And either one of those things by themselves, like totally converted into hip hop, would be really, really rad. If only because I'm just enamored of the idea of a rap song about this is the ways in which the world has broken and attempted to break us, and we didn't break. Take that, universe, which I think is really cool.
It made me think of the question of, like, you did performance poetry a lot, and you also do sort of page poetry. And where does that line go? Because like I love like performance poetry, and here in Houston we have Right About Now, which is like I have a lot of online videos on YouTube and stuff for performance poetry, and you can definitely see the like rap hip hop background there, and I think it must be interesting. Like I love the performance poets that have a book and I can read it on the page. I'm so excited, you know. But I also love like the performance and like where does that line lie? Like, what do you think about writing differently, or is it sort of the same process?
I think about the individual objects for both of those spaces differently, but the act of writing them is almost exactly the same. Which is like very interesting. Like if some of my spoken word colleagues were also, I know that a handful of spoken word colleagues or spoken word adjacent colleagues are present in the event right now, and I think the thing that I admire the most, that is not necessarily dissimilar about them, but the ways in which we think about those things are dissimilar, is you write for the space that you're in. So writing for a page is still writing for an audience that is perceiving you in real time, attempting to perform a thing. They're just not seeing your body. They just have to engage with your words. And writing for a stage is still writing for an audience that is attempting to read you and parse you as articulately as possible, but they don't get to look down and see subtitles. So you have to communicate with as much of your body as possible. And that changes the tools that you have and the way that you use those tools, but it doesn't very often change the radical intent of the work, or often doesn't even like ultimately ask you to do a lot of stuff to the words on the page themselves. I know I think that it's almost even universally true of some of the performance poets that I admire who also have published works, that if they put their book down and just read the poem that is published in the book, it will not sound to people who have experienced performance poetry as if it were published in a book, in part because of the assumptions that we make about publication, but also because they're using the tools at their disposal to ensure that you get it in the space where it's supposed to be. And I think that not only how you achieve that balance practically between the work on the page and the work as performed, and how you create work that is obviously engaging in those spaces, is like the kind of matter of crafts that I'm consistently interested in perfecting and getting better at. I can speak for a lot of my performance colleagues in particular, many of whom I will just like give a brief shout out to the handful of like poetry colleagues that are presently preparing for a spoken word competition that is taking place in Trinidad and Tobago over these next few weekends, who I'm very like inspired by and radically like engaged in that community. I love being a part of that community, and I love being able to think more deeply about how work exists in those spaces. And if it weren't for those kinds of people, if it weren't for having community with those kinds of people, I don't think I would ever have continued writing in the first place. And I think about how I fulfill my role in that community a lot as a result.
That was really great advice. So for the
I
spoken
hope
word
so.
poets.
I don't know.
I think so. So we have another question from Shivani, who says, we're often asked to jostle our agencies, Black, queer, Caribbean, non-binary. As Caribbean poets, we've also known how to subvert labels for a long time. Did the subversions in your debut challenge you in their composition? Did you find yourself writing beyond your expectations in response?
Ooh, this is a very lovely question. I should also mention
Love
that
it.
I like I have been both a witness and a participant in Shivani's brilliant, impeccable questioning. And like this is a very wonderful example of exactly how thoughtful Shivani's questions are. So yes, thank you so very much for this. I will say that it did in fact challenge me in that a lot of Blackness appears in this collection. Very obviously, it's a Black writer challenging the work of a writer so racist that the internet jokes about the name of his cat, which I hate. But a lot of it is also an attempt to not write about me, if that makes sense. That this is not like I tried as often as possible in the work to not be about how angry I am, because in these creative spaces, and especially when it comes to having conversations about the writers of the long dead writers of the classics of the canon, people like to make assumptions about the ways in which marginalized contemporary creators and readers exhibit their rage, and I didn't want that to be a target of the work. I wanted people to just deal with the work on its own merits, which is why a lot of the work is also funny as well, which is why it is so consistently willing not just to poke fun at uh, the creatures of the Lovecraft mythos, but to poke fun at some rappers. Like um, one of the other poems in this collection, one of my particular favorites, even though I probably also will never read it as regularly as I would like, Cathilla asks for Drake's autograph, is kind of terrible to Drake. Um, but I didn't want to write a book that would lead people who didn't know me but loved Lovecraft to go, this is just someone being angry because, of course, Black people are going to be angry about the thing. But also one of the more interesting kinds of like subversions in the work is like how we interact with the existence of our bodies in the first place, like what our bodies do, why are we identified by the why are we identified by what are assumed to be the strictures of our bodies when our bodies are actually homes for a great deal of wider and more imaginative self-knowing, which is why so many of the autograph poems are about these vast unknowable things coming to meet these celebrities and making assumptions about these celebrities as they are, and having the poem be an examination of the things that we did not know about them, or the things that why we make the assumptions that we do about them. Even the things that we learn as a result are bad or unhelpful. And while a lot of that is not directly tied up in me, a lot of it is a response to the assumptions that we make about the ways that we are in our bodies being a kind of tying up in the first place. Like, I am not locked in this. This is a rather freeing form. I just don't have to think about it as one thing. And even outside of like the Lovecraftian connections to this poem, one of the things that I'm particularly overjoyed that I get to add to this collection is there are 2 queer poems in this collection where the fundamental queerness of the space of the work is that our relationships with our bodies and our body's relationship with space is different and unfathomable, and that is why we are worthy of love and why we love each other in this moment. One of my favorite published poems that I'm very glad to add to this collection is Time and Time Again, which was published in Uncanny magazine. It was, if I'm not mistaken, the 2nd poem that I ever published in Uncanny. And it's about 2 men whose love for each other is so strong and so boundless that even when time and death rob them of the ability to continue being next to each other, they go, nah, I still want to be here, so I'm still going to be here. And people are going to have to deal with it. And I think that, like, when I wrote that, I just wanted to explore like the kind of like strange possibility of not being denied something that a lot of people in the real world are regularly denied, simply because other people get to write love stories where they do not deny themselves at all. And being able to tell those kinds of stories about queer people who are not denied because the universe refused to deny them is really radical in a way that I'm really glad to be able to share in a space like this.
Yeah, one of the things that a lot of reviewers commented on was the poem Because Who She Is Matters More Than Her Words. That poem, I think more than perhaps any of the others, I think stood out to people for this reason, that it's sort of intersectional and about this thing that women have dealt with a lot. And so it's really valuable to me to see this like broad sort of range of experience in your work. I appreciate
Mhm.
that.
I
Yeah.
really dig that poem.
I love it.
Um,
I was like, every time someone would comment on it, like if I read our like reviews, I don't read them too closely, but
I'm
because
glad you
it'll,
could do. I'm glad you could do that for me
yeah,
because I
yeah,
I, I keep hearing that reading comments is a terrible idea, so I've avoided them.
yeah, yeah. No, I read them, and that poem I think people really responded to. So
Mhm.
for a
I
lot
really
of
dig.
what,
That
yeah,
is one of the few poems that when I wrote it, I didn't think it was going to be in this collection, and then I found where it fit, and I was glad to
yeah,
put it there.
yeah,
But like, I
definitely,
also have obviously very strong feelings about that poem as somebody who writes speculative fiction and has been in speculative fiction spaces where astounding black women writers are treated absolutely terribly for no reason by people who do not know them and have never attempted to try to learn. And I want so very badly now that now that this book exists to just go to a world con, just like stand in a lobby and read this aloud and leave.
no, we should just
Like,
put together our Worldcon reading
that would
and
be rad,
like
right?
have just like the people who have angered the speculative fiction, uh, you know, there's just this old guard, I guess, of people
Mm-hmm.
who just really can't process there being new voices and marginalized voices not being marginalized anymore as much. Yeah, we should just have a reading of all that, just like make everybody
Yeah.
angry.
And um I mean, if this is not like too narcissistic, I guess, a thing to assume. I think one of the real beauties about speculative poetry as a form is that it's a space where a lot of marginalized creators in particular have gotten the opportunity to tell a lot of the radical versions of the stories that they want to tell in response to the quote unquote canon, the quote unquote old god, in ways that are both safe because those um like those that community of readers and fans are least likely to consider speculative poetry speculative in the first place and therefore will never meet us there.
Right.
And
It's not
also this,
speculative.
yeah, like no one reads poetry. Why is poetry in this magazine? I came here to read a short story. But also it's a place where you get to unlock a lot of the great depth of those kinds of radical works just because of the nature of those writers' experience with poetry as a form. And I think that they do a lot of really rad stuff. Um, and I think that like every individual one of those poems, of my favorite speculative poems, has like a culture shaping place in speculative fiction as a genre. And I'm just kind of like ultimately very pleased to just be like this small baby writer in the corner of that community being able to say I have
No.
a book now.
You're a leader now.
I mean, am
I
I?
think
I mean, I'd like to think so. I think it's very
I think
flattering,
so.
but I'm also like I think a lot about the fact that even in contemporary spaces I am very recent, and also about the like, and this is not me I'm trying not to sound modest because it's easy for modesty to be another experiment in ego. But um I've been a published writer of speculative fiction and poetry for only 6 years. I know 6 years doesn't sound very only, but still. And also, um, I'm a Black Caribbean writer in a space where a lot of my a lot of the mentors who I look up to very regularly are other Black Caribbean writers who have been in this space for a while and are doing really dope things. And I just want to be like them when I like have spent another 10 years in this space. I think very deeply about the responsibility I have as a result. Um, as someone who still considers themselves a baby now, to thinking more deeply about what I have to do in order to make this space more welcoming to someone who will look like me and enter this space uh 10, 20 years from now, who I hope never has to feel some of the ways that I feel about the genre sometimes when I came in.
Yeah, and I think it is just maybe like there has been this exponential change in the last couple of years, it seems like, because like I've been doing this review of like the books that are nominated for the Science Fiction Fantasy Poetry Association Award. And this last year I was like, wow, these are way, the just group of books nominated is just far more diverse than in previous years. And it's, I totally get that feeling of like responsibility, but I also do see authors responding to your work and feeling like they look up to you. And so I just want to like encourage you in that, because I know what you're doing matters to people. There's so many people that just I hear at cons or online who are just so valuing of the work that you're doing. And I think it is a leadership kind of role, and I hope that it continues, and in 5 more years we get way more of this kind of work, because it's so exciting and lovely. Um,
Thank you.
yeah, okay, we have maybe one more question, if that's okay.
Mhm.
This last question is, you do so many different things, game design, poetry, fiction, game streaming, and how do you kind of like juggle that? How do you switch between those different skills?
How do I switch, you say? Very interesting question. I'm glad that you asked. I don't. Um, time management is actually quite difficult for me. I think I'm not sure whether I can call this a good idea or a bad idea yet, but it just so happens to be my process where a lot of the time work just kind of overlaps in my brain. And I think about all of it in the same mode at the same time, and try very often to just, like, whenever I'm sitting down to do the thing, to commit the individual mode that is necessary to it. Um, I joke a lot about the fact that the side effect of this this desktop that I do all of my work at being in my bedroom is that whenever I'm not working is the only chance that I get to sleep, and whenever I'm not sleeping is the only chance that I get to work. Um, which is probably bad for my health, but
Oh my gosh, I think
also
I would be struggling.
yeah, a little bit. I mean, there is. And especially during the pandemic, there's been a considerable amount of struggle, obviously. Um, but I do think a lot of it is, um, yeah, not necessarily a kind of switching, but simply knowing that I have to be present for a thing and translating the overlap of skills that cross between all of these kinds of performances, just kind of shifting the dial from pointing away from the thing that I'm supposed to be doing right now to pointing towards it. Like, as mentioned, I do a lot of live streaming of tabletop role playing game actual plays. Like, I'm literally supposed to play an RPG immediately after this stream ends. See, total, like, I'm very good at balancing my time. But a lot of the resources that you have as a performer are already there when you're playing an RPG. Because there is performance, there is like the awareness of your body, there is awareness of projection, there is like awareness of like your character in that space and its relationship with other people and with the work, just that the work is a game instead of a poem or a play or something like that. um all writing still relies on some of the same tools. We just need to shift the ways in which those tools are used. So it's a lot of the time it is really just me going, okay, I need to stop thinking about this as a game now, unless thinking about it like a game is going to be particularly clever. But if not, I need to start thinking about this as a poem and like stop what I was doing and start doing this. And then much more importantly than that is when I am not working, I need to stop thinking about work. And I think that ultimately, no matter what you're doing, no matter what career space you're in, what kind of creative mode you engage in, one of the things that is very important to learn, especially during the pandemic, is a lot of the time you will not be working, and you need to take that time when you're not working and actively not work. As a freelancer, you need to set your own closing time, at which point you're not going to reply to an email unless it's absolutely necessary. No one can ask you questions about your book because you cannot answer questions about your book at 8 o'clock in the night because you just want to watch some TV finally for once. And I think that that's ultimately more important, especially in the wake of some of these struggles that people have had balancing their work in these difficult kinds of situations in the first place. I think it's really important to be able to say, sometimes you are not at work. And not being at work sometimes is the thing that makes work valuable and engaging when work comes up.
Okay, hateful. But I'm kidding. Like, are you
It's very
speaking to me
difficult, but
directly?
still. Oh Lord, yes. I mean, we're all kind of in the same space, so obvious, but
Yeah.
I like it kind of difficult. I imagine it's particularly even more difficult for people who are creative and in a producer role as well. Which is like I actually kind of envy the kind of commitment that you have to Interstellar Flight Press, to not only making good work, and having it released regularly and participating in the marketing process, um, as a lean publishing team, while also putting out your own books. Like the fact that you have a book that's coming out in the
I know,
same
right?
period of time as mine is like you could have like prioritized yourself and I wouldn't have judged you.
No. I mean, everything I always see it as like everything I do is a part of the kind of community, and like we are very, very lucky to have really fantastic writers, but also like this huge group of volunteers who, whenever I'm like stressed out, I'm on our like Discord and I'm like, oh, and they're like, I'll help you, Holly. They're so lovely. I'm like, thank you very much. But yeah, I mean, I feel that like I struggle with the sort of like setting a boundary. I don't know. I feel like I did fine before the pandemic, but somehow in the pandemic it sort of went off the rails, and so it's good
Mhm.
advice.
I'm glad I I'm
I'm
glad
kidding.
I could be that helpful.
Yeah. Okay, so that's all of our questions. Brandon, I was going to ask if you wanted to read one more poem.
Well, yes, I'd love to read one more poem.
Please do.
What should I read? In fact, because we mentioned it by name, I will read the poem that you mentioned that you loved a great deal, because I also love it a
Yes.
great deal. I would love to read it. So this poem is called Because Who She Is Matters More Than Her Words. There is a wolf prowling in the stalks outside a Black woman's Twitter profile, gnawing at the bark of unsheathed pencils and waiting to leap at an unsuspecting neck. Moonlight strikes the head of a rocket statue to trigger the pack. They howl and scrape at the spines of scary galleys with names they gutturally mispronounce for fun. But the heroine of this story just takes her first draft and rolls it up, throws the dusk to dawn lights on outside the house that knows itself, and swats some of the tykes on their noses till they scatter. Her neighbor puts up a warning. The residents here ain't the ones. The next HOA meeting makes a fence of bodies, gathers its own nets, immunizes its own from fatal ideas, puts buckshot in the barrels of their fountain pens. We will hear about another pack before day even breaks. Best believe. But even our kids will know. Will put pebbles in their slingshots as warning. They will tell stories in the cafeteria about how their mothers were good with the blades of pens, how they learned how to hold one early, how nobody could ever tell them nothing about who they were. And one night, when harvest night calls for starving wolves, those children will reach for their mother's weapons and cast light like there is no night.
Beautiful. It's always weird when you're on like Zoom. Everyone's like clapping quietly. Thank you so much for encouraging this event and for publishing your work and publishing your poetry and being a part of the community and constantly being in conversation about difficult things and putting yourself out there and all the things that you do, because it is very, very valuable and we are very glad to have you. And everyone check out Brandon's book, Can You Sign My
Right.
Tentacle?
I
It
almost
is
forgot.
up. Yeah.
I want you to show them some of the pages inside the book.
Oh, yeah.
Because there are some very cool things in the book other than the poems. I also
Yeah.
definitely want to shout out the cover art by Trevor Fraley, which is really, really dope. But also there are tentacles in the book. And they're
Yeah,
really, really
so
cool.
this is the like opening kind of page. This is our first time doing these sort of like bleed pages, which is a lot of fun. And let's see, let me find another one. You know, they just kind of like get into the book in places. So it was a lot of fun exploring that aspect, kind of as a publisher, like how can I make this work? Even the table of contents has some
Nice.
So that was a lot of fun creating that, you know, and we're exploring more unique types of books like that. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank
Well,
you.
yeah, this has been lovely. I really appreciate it. And I think that's about it for us.